Going back to Godhead, as presented by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, depicted in Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita. I will first chant some mantras in order to set the proper mentality. Trinadapi sunichena, tarariva sahishnuna, amanina manadena, kirtaniya sadahari. Hare Nama, Hare Nama, Hare Nama eva kevalam. Kalau nastyeva, 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 gatir anyata. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Sri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. I'm Gurave Namaha. The term back to Godhead has been quoted by Srila Prabhupada 2,813 times if we look at his recorded lectures, his writings, conversations, etc. This term back to Godhead is a fundamental concept of the Krishna consciousness movement. In this first part, I would like to present a series of verses from Srimad Bhagavatam, which will help us to understand the original position of the Jiva living entity. This occurs in the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 8th chapter, where Maharaj Parikshit asks Shukadeva Goswami, O learned Brahmana, the transcendental spirit soul is different from the material body. Does he acquire the body accidentally or by some cause? Will you kindly explain this, for it is known to you? So right here, we see that Maharaj Parikshit is asking a very fundamental and important question. He realizes that the spirit soul is transcendental, and he uses the term acquires the body. In other words, the inference is that the spirit soul was originally without a material body and at some point acquired it. But he wants Shukadeva Goswami to answer his question. In the next chapter, chapter 9, Shukadeva Goswami answers this question in 3 verses. Shukadeva Goswami replies, O king, unless one is influenced by the energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no meaning to the relationship of the pure soul in pure consciousness with the material body. That relationship is just like a dreamer's seeing his own body working. The illusioned living entity appears in so many forms offered by the external energy of the Lord. While enjoying in the modes of material nature, the encaged living entity misconceives, thinking in terms of I and mine. And as soon as the living entity becomes situated in his constitutional glory and begins to enjoy the transcendence beyond time and material energy, he at once gives up the 2 misconceptions of life, I and mine, and thus becomes fully manifested as the pure self. So before we look at Srila Prabhupada's purport to these verses, I would like to give a very simple explanation in my own words to make it very easy for you to understand. So notice how Shukadeva Goswami explains. He says that material life is a dreaming state. And Prabhupada will talk about this in the purport. That there is no relationship of the pure soul in pure consciousness with the material body, just like in a dreaming state. So he says next, the illusion living entity, the dreaming living entity, appears in so many forms. In other words, there are 8,400,000 different types of bodies. But those bodies are offered by the external energy, which is fully under the control of the Supreme Lord. And what is the basis of material consciousness? I and mine. But then he also says that if you give up this consciousness of I and mine and go back to your pure consciousness, then you are again the pure self. So Srila Prabhupada writes throughout his books, what is that original pure consciousness? It is called Krishna consciousness. Lord Chaitanya, in his teachings to Sanatana Goswami, says that the living entity, the jiva, is the eternal servant of Krishna. So that word eternal means always in the past, always in the present, and always in the future. The living entity, as Srila Prabhupada teaches throughout his books, is that he is always in the constitutional position of being the servant. But the living entity has free will. And with that free will, the living entity can choose either to serve the Lord, which is his constitutional position, or misuse that free will and try to enjoy the material energy. But in either case, the living entity still remains a servant. Either one is a servant of Krishna, or one is a servant of the material energy, thinking that one is the enjoyer, and that's the Maya. The Maya is, although one is constitutionally a servant, Maya allows one to think that one is the enjoyer, but actually he is the servant, not the enjoyer. So going back to Godhead means to go back to your original position. Srila Prabhupada teaches the original position is one of eternal service to Krishna, because that is one's original constitutional position. So now, let us look at Prabhupada's purport, and he will explain this in a very, very nice way. Prabhupada says, Maharaj Parikshit's question as to how a living entity began his material life. Notice, same thing that Maharaj Parikshit was saying, that material life does have a beginning, which infers that there was a state before material life, because we know from the Bhagavad Gita that the living entity is eternal. There is no beginning to the living entity. Chapter 2 Bhagavad Gita explains that. The living entity always existed. So there is a beginning to material life. So since there's a beginning to material life and there's no beginning to spiritual life, that means the original position is a spiritual position. And as I just said, the original position is that one is eternally serving Krishna. But we do find there is a beginning to material life. Let's continue. How the living entity began his material life, although he is apart from the material body and mind, and is perfectly answered. Yes, that's the first lesson of Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is the beginning book of transcendental knowledge, and Krishna begins his instructions on this point, that the living entity is not the material body or the material mind. And later in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna will inform us that the living entity is his part and parcel. Let's continue with the purport. The spirit soul is distinct from the material conception of life, but He is absorbed in such a material conception because of being influenced by the external energy of the Lord, called Atma Maya. This has already been explained in the first canto in connection with Vyasadev's realization of the Supreme Lord and his external energy. Prabhupada is referring to an earlier verse in the first canto. This particular section of Bhagavatam is in second canto. That is the context. The external energy is controlled by the Lord, and the living entities are controlled by the external energy by the will of the Lord. And that is an important concept which Prabhupada will also further discuss as we proceed with this purport. Therefore, although the living entity is purely conscious in his pure state, he is subordinate to the will of the Lord in being influenced by the external energy of the Lord. In the Bhagavad Gita, the same thing is confirmed. The Lord is present in the heart of every living entity, and all the living entities' consciousness and forgetfulness are influenced by the Lord. So now Prabhupada, knowing the mind of most everybody, is going to answer a question which is probably on everybody's mind. Now the next question automatically made will be why the Lord influences the living entity to such consciousness and forgetfulness. That is a significant point, because it appears as though God is being somewhat vindictive, that God is punishing the living entity, subjecting him to the material world, because throughout the Vedas, throughout Prabhupada's teachings, the material world, the external energy, is compared to a prison. For one to be put in a prison, one has to become a criminal. One has to do something that makes one worthy to be a prisoner. So someone up to this point hearing this purport would object. Why does God put the living entity in the material energy into the prison house? Now let's see how Prabhupada answers the question. The answer is that the Lord clearly wishes that every living entity be in his pure consciousness as part and parcel of the Lord, and thus be engaged in the loving service of the Lord as he is constitutionally made. This we have already stated, so it's nice to see that Prabhupada is confirming what I explained previously. But because the living entity is partially independent, that's another important concept, partially independent. God is completely independent, but the jiva, the soul, is only partially independent. So, because the living entity is partially independent, he or she may not be willing to serve the Lord, but may try to become as independent as the Lord is. And that's the key sentence right here. Because we have free will, at any moment we can decide, I no longer want to serve God. I want to be God. I want to be the enjoyer. That is what we call misuse of minute free will. All the non-devotee living entities are desirous of becoming equally as powerful as the Lord, although they are not fit to become so. Yes, that is the illusion. I want to be the Lord, but I don't have the potency to do that, because by my constitutional nature, I am meant to be the servant, not God. But I have that free will, and I may desire to imitate or want to usurp the Lord's position, but I don't have the qualifications. Prabhupada will explain this further. The living entities are illusioned by the will of the Lord because they wanted to become like Him. Like a person who thinks of becoming a king without possessing the necessary qualification. When the living entity desires to become the Lord Himself, he is put into a condition of dreaming that he is a king. And this ties into what Shukadeva Goswami was saying. Prabhupada is taking what Shukadeva said and is explaining it. So as soon as the living entity wants to imitate the Lord or become like the Lord, he is put into a dreaming condition. Now this next sentence is so nice by Prabhupada. Therefore, the first sinful will of the living entity is to become the Lord. So here is the original sin. And notice, the first sinful will. In other words, the living entity has minute independence. And with it, minute independence, the living entity at any time, in any situation, material or spiritual, can will either I will serve the Lord or I will try to become the Lord. There's no question here of external influence, which is an argument sometimes people give, that unless there is an external influence. No, this comes from the very nature of the individual. There's no external influence. It comes from the free will of the living entity itself, wanting to try to imitate the Lord. So I'll repeat. Therefore, the first sinful will of the living entity is to become the Lord. And the consequent will of the Lord is that the living entity forget his factual life and thus dream of the land of utopia where he may become one like the Lord. So the factual life is, I am the eternal servant of Krishna. The dreaming or the utopian state is, I am God. I am one with God. Prabhupada now gives a nice example. A child cries to have the moon from the mother. And so the mother gives the child a mirror to satisfy the crying and disturbing child with the reflection of the moon. Similarly, the crying child of the Lord is given over to the reflection, the material world, to lord it over as karmi, and to give this up in frustration to become one with the Lord. This is directly in line with the opening verses of chapter 15 of Bhagavad Gita, how the material world is a perverted reflection of the spiritual world. It is a perverted reflection. Both these stages are dreaming illusions only. So what are the two dreaming illusions? Being a karmi or fruitive worker, or trying to become one, the jnani, trying to become one with the Lord. Now this next sentence should answer other questions. There is no necessity of tracing out the history when the living entity desired this. This question we get all the time. It doesn't matter when, and neither will you be able to figure it out because it happened so long ago, and there's no way you're going to know when the dream began. But the fact is that as soon as he desired it, he was put under the control of Atma Maya by the direction of the Lord. Therefore, the living entity in his material condition is dreaming falsely that this is mine and this is I. The dream is that the conditioned soul thinks of his material body as I, or falsely thinks he is the Lord, and that everything in connection with that material body is mine. Thus, only in dream does the misconception of I and mine persist life after life. And this continues life after life, as long as the living entity is not purely conscious of his identity as the subordinate part and parcel of the Lord. At this point, I think it would be good to further explain this concept of the dream, because there are so many verses throughout the Srimad Bhagavatam, several dozen verses, where material existence is compared to a dream. And it is no different than the dream that you have at night. While you're in a dreaming state, it is very, very real to you. But a person who is observing you on the bed sees that you are lying on the bed. But for you who is in the dream, whether it be a good dream or a bad dream, it is very, very real. And so the Bhagavatam teaches, and I said there are several dozen verses, that material existence is just like that dream. And while you're in that dream, it is very, very real. You've experienced pleasure, pain. You experience birth and death. But when you become completely Krishna conscious, or when you go back home, back to Godhead, then you will realize that your entire material existence was just a dream. But while you're in the dream, it is very, very real. And unlike the dream that you have while you're sleeping in bed, that you just wake up by hearing a sound, waking up from the material dream is a little different. Lord Chaitanya says, Jeev Jago, wake up, living entity. Yes, the question now is, if you accept that you are now in a dreaming condition, that material existence is a real dream that you're experiencing, the question is, how do I wake up from this dream? Because I'm alive, I'm awake, and it doesn't seem like a dream. How do I get out of the dream? Yes, and the answer is Krishna consciousness. It is the message of Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, you want to wake up from material existence? He says it more than once in Bhagavad Gita, surrender to me. In chapter 7, Krishna says that this material energy is insurmountable. So the dreaming state of material existence is insurmountable. But Krishna says there is one way. You surrender to him. And then at the end of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says the same thing. You should surrender to me. When Krishna says surrender to me, he's doing that because he wants you to wake up from the dream of material existence, which we are all undergoing. It's a dream, but as far as you're concerned, you're in it, you're experiencing. You are going to work, you're undergoing birth, death, old age, disease, raising a family, all the different aspects of material life. It's very real to you, yes, but it's still a dream. But the only way to wake up is to surrender to Krishna. And that is the message of Bhagavad Gita. That is the message of Srimad Bhagavatam. And that is the message of Srila Prabhupada's teachings. You should wake up from the dream and go back to your original position. And where is that? Prabhupada uses the term back to Godhead. Prabhupada understood clearly the meaning of the words he used. This word back signifies that Prabhupada is saying that originally you were in the kingdom of God. Godhead means the kingdom of God. Either you were with Krishna or you were with one of Krishna's expansions in some other Vaikuntha planet, but you were in Godhead, the spiritual world. That is your original position. And now, when you wake up from the dream, you will go back. Back means you were somewhere before, and now you're going back. Prabhupada understands English very clearly. And as I said in the beginning, over 2,800 times recorded that we have record of, Prabhupada used this term, back to Godhead. So Godhead is the original position. And your material life, which began at some point, is the dreaming state. And now the idea is to wake up, as Lord Chaitanya says, Jeev Jago. Wake up from the dreaming state and go back to Godhead. Let us continue with Prabhupada's purport. In one's pure consciousness, however, there is no misconceived dream. In that pure conscious state, the living entity does not forget that he or she is never the Lord. I have to repeat that because it may sound a little awkward. In the pure state, one does not forget that one is never the Lord. In other words, in pure consciousness, you are always conscious that you are the eternal servant of God. But that one, and he says here, but that one is eternally the servitor of the Lord in transcendental love. And when we use this word love, there has to be free will. Unless there's free will, then there's no question of love. So that minute free will, that is part and parcel of the soul, of the living entity. And the living entity at any moment, in any condition, material or spiritual, can make a choice. Do I want to serve God or do I want to serve illusion? Prabhupada continues, the different forms of the living entities are different dresses offered by the illusory external energy of the Lord according to the modes of nature. And it is according to how the living entity desires to enjoy. The external material energy is represented by her three modes, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance. So even in the material nature, there is a chance of independent choice by the living entity. Yes, Prabhupada is emphasizing, you always have your minute free will. You always have independent choice. And according to one's choice, the material energy offers one different varieties of material bodies. So, we are understanding that because of that free will, at any moment, as we are advised in the Bhagavad Gita, we can surrender to Krishna. Now the question is, how do I surrender to Krishna? And the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam is very clear. The way to surrender to Krishna is through devotional service, bhakti yoga, by rendering service to Krishna, by hearing about him, by chanting his name or chanting his glories, by remembering the Lord's holy name, fame, form, pastimes, worshiping the Lord, and rendering confidential servant. There are 9 different processes, and Lord Chaitanya emphasized the first 2 are the fundamental, because without the first 2, you cannot go on to the other 7. So hearing and chanting about the Lord are the fundamental principles of waking up from the dream and going back home, back to Godhead, your original position. So what is this Godhead? This Godhead is described throughout the pages of Srimad Bhagavatam. It is hinted in the Bhagavad Gita and also nicely described in the Brahma Samhita. Godhead is the kingdom of God. God is a person, and he dwells in his own spiritual abode, which is free from birth, death, old age, and disease. It's an eternal abode, no beginning, no middle, no end. The kingdom of God is divided into two regions. The topmost planet of the kingdom of God is known as Krishna Loka, the abode of Krishna. And even that planet is divided into three sections: Dwaraka, Mathura, and Vrindavan. And each of these three realms, Krishna is the supreme enjoyer, surrounded by innumerable loving devotees. The other section of Godhead, or the kingdom of God, is known as the innumerable Vaikuntha planets. On each of those planets, Lord Narayan is situated, and his eternal consort is Goddess Lakshmi. And there he is served like a king, like the King of Kings, with all his innumerable servants. And on these Vaikuntha planets, the devotees, the worshippers, are enjoying different kinds of mukti, or liberation. Some of them have the same form as the Lord himself, with 4 arms, dark bluish complexion. That is called a sarupya. Another liberation is salokya, that one is allowed to live on the same planet, in the same area as the Lord, such as the residents of Ayodhya. They who worshiped Lord Ram, they went to his planet in Vaikuntha, the spiritual or transcendental Ayodhya, and served Lord Ram and Sita there. Then there is Sarshti, where one enjoys the same opulence as the Lord. The Lord has unlimited opulence, and some devotees are allowed to share those opulences. And then there is the stage of Samipya, another kind of liberation or mukti, where one has a kind of friendship with the Lord, more close friendship with the Lord. But let's discuss Krishna Loka, the planet of Krishna. On Krishna's planet, we have Mathura, and there the devotees are allowed to relate to the Lord very nicely. And then there is Dwaraka, where Krishna is the king of Dwaraka, and he is surrounded by his queens, and the devotees there render service to him. And then there is the most beloved Vrindavan, Goloka Vrindavan. There God is the transcendental cowherd boy, surrounded by his loving devotees, and they have unsurpassed, unequaled, spontaneous love and affection for Krishna. So we'll just describe Krishna Loka, and from this description you can get a general idea of what it's like to live in the kingdom of God. So in this Goloka Vrindavan, Krishna is the cowherd boy, and so the land, there is grass, there are trees known as Kalpa Vriksha trees. These trees are spiritual trees. They're alive. Actually, Chintamani, everything in the kingdom of God is conscious. It is not dead matter like this material world. In the kingdom of God, the land, the trees, the cows, the river, the people, everything is alive and conscious. Everything is transcendental. So you may be in the spiritual world a blade of grass, but you will be conscious that yes, Krishna is walking over me. Or you may be a cow in the spiritual world, and you will respond to Krishna when he calls your name, because all of Krishna's cows have a name, and Krishna calls his cows and calves with love, and they come to him. You may be the servant of Krishna, serving Mother Yashoda as a gopi, or you may be one of Krishna's cowherd boyfriends, where you get to play with Krishna all day, get to wrestle with him, or eat with him, play with him, sleep with him. And then there are the gopis, the topmost devotees of them all. The gopis enjoy the conjugal relationship with Krishna as he performs his Rasa Leela dance, and they enjoy amorous pastimes as lover and beloved. Now, on another topic, there is this idea, which I have gleaned from Prabhupada's teachings, that there is promotion. For instance, during the advent of Lord Ram, there were certain sages who approached Lord Ram, and they wanted to have a conjugal relationship with him. They had studied the scriptures, the Vedas, and they were aware of this Madhurya Ras. But Lord Ram responded to these sages by explaining that in this particular incarnation on earth, he had taken a vow, Eka Patni Vrata, by which he would only have one wife. But he told the sages that in his next appearance, when he would come in his original form of Krishna, he would fulfill their desires for the conjugal relationship. And indeed, when Krishna appeared 5,000 years ago, those sages appeared as the daughters of cowherd women. And when Krishna blew his transcendental flute, they were promoted. Prabhupada uses this word. They were promoted to the status of gopis, and they were allowed to enter the rasa dance along with Krishna's other eternal transcendental gopi associates. So that is there. You have already your constitutional position, but there is also mention of a promotion. So in this kingdom of God, you will have activity, and that activity will be surrounding Krishna. So in the kingdom of God, there is constant transcendental activity. It is not a state of simply meditation. It is active service, but the service is centered around Krishna, either in Goloka Vrindavan or in the other Vaikuntha planets with Lord Narayan. When you are situated in the kingdom of God, you will have an active service. That active service is always there. It's eternally, constitutionally part of the kingdom of God. Active service. And there you will enjoy your life eternally, having this loving relationship with Krishna. So the message of the Bhagavad Gita, the message of Srimad Bhagavatam, the message of Srila Prabhupada is that one is being invited to return back home, back to Godhead, and engage in your original constitutional position of eternal loving service to Krishna. And the simplest, easy way to achieve this is to begin Krishna consciousness. And Lord Chaitanya recommends that you simply chant the holy name. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. To go back to Godhead, Lord Chaitanya and Srila Prabhupada have made it very simple. You just need to lead a pure life and chant the holy name of God. To lead a pure life means to give up sinful activities. Sinful activities are basically of four kinds: illicit sex, intoxication, meat eating, and gambling. These are the four pillars of the house of sin. If one knocks down these pillars, if one completely gives up these four sinful activities, then one's life can be considered pure. Now, on top of that, you add the performance of devotional service centered around the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, the names of God. Now you are living a transcendental life. And when you live a transcendental life, you are now eligible to be promoted back home, back to Godhead. So Srila Prabhupada emphasizes, give up these sinful activities of illicit sex, meat eating, intoxication, and gambling, and chant the Hare Krishna mantra and go back home, back to Godhead. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So we have discussed the original position of the living entity. We have discussed back to Godhead and what is Godhead. So I'd like to give a quick conclusion summary of what one should take from this presentation. Srila Prabhupada's teachings reveal that the jiva, the living entity, was originally situated in a direct loving relationship with Lord Krishna or Lord Narayan in a spiritual planet. The cause for the living entity leaving this original situation is misuse of free will. This free will is an inherent spiritual quality of the soul, and its exercise does not depend upon the action of any external force such as Maya or the material illusory energy. Misuse of free will is motivated by envy of the Supreme Lord, by the desire to usurp the Lord's position as supreme enjoyer and imitate his pastimes. Srila Prabhupada even goes so far as to give a confidential glimpse of the exchanges that go on between Krishna and a soul who is intent on misusing its free will. Krishna tries to convince the soul not to misuse free will, but if the soul insists, then one goes to the material world by the arrangement of the Lord. But the Lord accompanies the living entity as Supersoul and is always eager to have the soul come back to him. When the soul goes back to Godhead, there is nothing new but merely a return to the original position. Srila Prabhupada also teaches that in fact we do not really fall from the spiritual world, but we simply forget our relationship with Krishna. We are just like a dreaming man. He is sleeping on his own bed, but he forgets this and dreams that he is somewhere else. And when he wakes up from his dream, he finds himself still in his own bed. Actually, he never left the bed. Similarly, when we desire to forget Krishna, we are put into the dream of material life. Actually, we do not fall. We remain in our position. but we simply forget it, and in the dream of material life, it appears we have fallen away from our original position. But when we wake up from the dream of material life, we find ourselves still in our original position, where we had been all along. In any case, the clear essence of Srila Prabhupada's teaching about our original condition is that we were once with Krishna. This conclusion also finds support from Srimad Bhagavatam and from the teachings of the previous acharyas. The conditioned souls, now in this material world, were originally in a direct relationship of service to Krishna in the spiritual world. Now some may ask, how long? Actually, that question doesn't matter, because however long you've been in the material world, compared to eternity, it's insignificant. And when you wake up again in the spiritual world, like a dream, it will seem like a moment only. Again, when you have a dream at night, it may seem during the dream that it went on for a long time. But when you woke up from your dream, you realized, oh, it was just a dream. And you're no longer concerned about how long the dream was, because you realize what it was. It was a dream. So in the same way, once you go back home, back to Godhead, it won't matter how many millions of lifetimes you were here. It won't matter to you, because now you will have woken up from the dream, and compared to eternity, it is most insignificant. By misuse of our free will, manifested as a desire to imitate the Lord and become the supreme enjoyer, some souls have given up their natural position, and they have been placed in the material world. But by proper use of free will, they will again regain their original position. And this is another concept that we see Prabhupada uses over and over again throughout his lectures, throughout his books. Regain. That means it was already there, it was lost, now you're regaining. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.